David Hayward, the convener for the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution World Affairs series of talks. Shortly I will be in conversation with one of the most well-known journalists and authors in the US, Barton Gellman, ex-The Washington Post and now staff writer at The Atlantic, as well as senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Previously, he was author in residence at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs and fellow at New York University's Brennan Center for Justice. Along with Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, he reported on the US National Security Agency based on information provided by Edward Snowden. Bart started work full-time at the Washington Post in 1988. During his time there, he covered a wide range of subjects, including the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the global AIDS pandemic, the global war on terror, and the misuse of WMD intelligence. In 2010, he left the Post to concentrate on book and magazine writing, including a period at Time covering US extremist militant militias. He has received many awards for his journalism, including 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 George Polk Awards, and Harvard's Goldsmith Prize. Whilst at the Post, he published Contending with Keenan, Towards a Philosophy of American Power, and Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency. In 2013, Verax, shortly revealed as Edward Snowden, contacted him via Laura Poitras with information pertaining to US National Security Agency's worldwide spying on citizens' electronic communications. He rejoined the Post in May that year to lead the paper's coverage of the exposé. His recent book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State, tells of the hidden infrastructure that connects US government spying with Silicon Valley. Hi Bart, how are you today?
Very well, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So where are you actually speaking from today?
I'm in a county called Putnam County, about an hour north of New York City.
Okay, and this is where you live, is it?
Well, it's where I've been for the past several months of the pandemic.
And I was going to come on to that. So this is one of the effects of the pandemic. You've moved out of the city?
Yeah, I've been trying to avoid breathing elevator air.
Yeah, elevator air and metro air, I think, as 2 of the biggest problems. We've certainly seen a lot of people trying to avoid elevators and the tube in the UK as well.
Right, I'm happy to be away from New York's subway and in some place sort of quiet and greener than my normal.
Okay, very good. Now, your interest in journalism seems to have started when you were at school, and you did a series of articles, stories on teenage pregnancy. How did that come about, and how did it actually work out?
The truth is, it was deliberately a little bit provocative, just got me more provocation than I expected. I was trying to change the secondary school newspaper from being kind of lapdog of the principal to an independent voice. And I chose a subject that was pertinent and important to the local community, but also had previously been litigated as being within the rights of a high school student to publish. My principal didn't see it that way, and she seized all copies of the issue and burned them. Right. And literally burned them, which is, I didn't know it's still a thing in the 20th century. But she did, and she fired me, and I took her to federal court.
Okay. And did you win?
It was settled favorably, but who won is debatable. It wasn't settled until I was well into my freshman year at university. Okay. So I was given the right to publish the story most of a year after I had left high school. So she achieved her aim.
Okay. Now, when you left school, you went to university, but in 1988, you joined the staff of the Washington Post.
I did.
A long and successful career. What were some of the most important stories that you covered during that time?
Well, on my first beat covering the local courthouse, I had the great journalistic good fortune to cover the rather colorful trial of the then mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, who had sort of managed to buy and use drugs on camera in an undercover sting. So that was actually an amazing brew of politics, race, policing, and all sorts of things, and lasted rather a long time. I covered the Persian Gulf War, the first one, as the Pentagon correspondent, and the accession into the U.S. military of openly gay people and women in combat roles. My next job was overseas in the Jerusalem bureau for the Washington Post, where I covered war and peace. The Oslo Accords were new. Rabin and Arafat were negotiating. I covered the assassination of Rabin and interviewed his assassin, actually, before the event. I, of course, didn't know his significance at the time, but at the time that I met Yigal Amir, he was already stalking the prime minister. And it's not to my credit as a journalist that I didn't recognize him as being a special sort of angry settler. He just seemed like one of the gang.
Okay.
Came back, covered the U.S. State Department and the Secretary Madeleine Albright at the time. I did a long series on the UN inspections in Iraq, which were meant to disarm it of weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. There was, of course, a time when Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction, had chemical and biological agents, and a relatively advanced nuclear weapons program that had yet to produce a weapon. And UN teams were disarming it. I wrote about American espionage operations within that disarmament. The U.S. was using the UN inspectors without their knowledge to spy on Iraq on things having nothing to do with the WMD, and that was quite controversial.
Yes, I imagine.
That was my last beat assignment, my last sort of regular gig on one subject, and after that, for the next 10 years, I was sort of free-floating investigative reporter, picking one project at a time. So it might be a biographical series on Bill Bradley, who was running for president. It was a year spent on global AIDS, the way the world looked away from the growth of that pandemic and the responsibility of the World Health Organization and major governments and pharmaceutical industry for averting their gaze when they could have done something. And that led me to 9/11, because everything I was working up until then had to be set aside. 9/11 was this sort of cataclysmic event, obviously. And so I started looking into the war on terrorism, as it was called, and what that really meant.
Okay.
After that came Dick Cheney. I did a series in the newspaper on Cheney.
Yes. And, I mean, whilst you were at the Post, you wrote a couple of books contending with Keegan and Angler. And Angler, of course, is focused on the Cheney vice presidency.
It is. The book on George Kennan was an outgrowth of my undergraduate thesis at Princeton, where I'd written an attempt to look at his worldview in systematic terms, because he never does so himself. He's someone who prefers to write about individual events and historical moments rather than to espouse a philosophy of foreign policy. And so I tried to unpack from all his magnificent writings about individual events an underlying theory of the world. That was a rather academic book, and I finished it while I was very new at the Washington Post. the Angler book, Angler being Dick Cheney's Secret Service code name, which had more than one interpretation possible, was a book that followed a series in the Washington Post about the vice presidency. It was probably about 10,000 words in the Post and about 100,000 in the book version, because it filled out the reporting quite considerably. And it was a look at Cheney's approach to power. How did he accumulate it? How did he use it? He's kind of a genius at that. He used the vice presidency, which had not been a powerful office, he formed it into a lever that moved the whole government policy on a wide range of subjects, from the economy to the environment, and of course to national security.
Yes, and he, of course, had some very able accomplices in his movement as well, didn't he?
He had indeed. He reached around government, found allies in a number of places. They weren't necessarily running their organizations inside the government. He found, for example, in the Justice Department, he reached down 2 levels to the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the advisory office that tells the federal government what's lawful and what's not. And he didn't choose the chief of that office. He found an ally in one of the ordinary lawyers there, and kept asking for secret legal memos that would enable him to do what he wanted to do. So it's very strange. It's very unusual for someone at even the cabinet level, but certainly the vice president, to reach down into the bureaucracy that way. But Cheney had a way of finding allies who would tell him what he wanted to hear.
Yes. I mean, reading the book, I felt shocked, really, at the way that things were manipulated. But you were very clear at the end that you felt that Cheney did it all because he believed it was the right thing to do.
He is a true believer, and Cheney's critics don't necessarily like to hear that. They'd rather have him just be a sort of mustache-twirling villain, sort of bent on conquering the world. But he's a zealot, in fact, and he took 9/11 as confirmation of his worldview and as an opportunity to carry out plans he had his whole adult life.
Yes. And of course, he was allowed to do it as well by George Bush.
He was. That relationship evolved quite a bit over time, but Bush was a new and inexperienced president. Cheney was about as experienced as you get in public life, and Bush leaned on him rather heavily. Cheney was very good at advising Bush, at being sort of the last word. He would tend not to say what he thought in front of other people. He would sort of whisper it into Bush's ear near the end of the decision process. He was very deferential, whether he felt that way or not. And from time to time, he would do things behind Bush's back.
And certainly behind the back of other members of the executive.
Right. Well, he found it's quite a bit easier to win a fight if the other side doesn't know it's happening.
Yes, yes. Well, after 21 years, you decided to leave the Post and become an author and write magazines. So what prompted the career change? I
had been tending towards sort of longer and more ambitious work. I wanted to spend more time on projects. I wanted to tell the stories at greater length, to have the ability to just sort of have the freedom of narrative to tell a tale more naturally than in a standard newspaper story. And I had a difference of view with the editor of the Washington Post in any case, so it was a good time to strike off on my own.
So you wrote a number of Time articles. What sorts of subjects did you cover in those?
They were a lot of fun. They were good sort of meaty pieces and long for the magazine. It was I did a couple of pieces on Mitt Romney when he was running for president. One was about the influence of his mother on his political development, which was rather considerable and much less well known than the influence of his famous father, who had been a governor and cabinet official under President Nixon. I did another piece on the way his business life had formed his thinking. Okay. So they were attempts to understand the man by a close look at his past. I did a cover story on the growth of right-wing extreme militias in the United States, which remains even more pronounced situation today. And what was their worldview and what were they doing about it? I actually went out on a quasi-military exercise with one militia group in Ohio and sort of slept out in the field, and they marched around with their long rifles and their plan, and it was a thinly disguised tactical exercise in how you fight a federal task force, like from the DEA or the FBI. Their enemy in this group, in this exercise, was clearly a stand-in for federal officers whom they believed they might one day have to fight.
You didn't feel threatened?
I didn't feel great. I felt I was on the edge of my comfort level, I have to say. But I've been around, a lot of them were ex-military people. And I'd spent some time at the Pentagon around troops. I knew their language, and I just blended in.
Okay, good. But then in early 2013, you received some encrypted information that led you to work with Edward Snowden on one of the major news stories of the last 50 years. How did that unfold?
Well, he arrived in my inbox with an encrypted message from an anonymous account directing me to create my own anonymous account. And it happened that I knew how to use these digital security tools that he was using, because I'd grown rather paranoid myself about how to keep my confidential sources safe. And he was using a handle called Verax. If I'm saying that right, it's Latin for truth teller, which I had to look up. And I didn't know whether it was a man or a woman, old or young. He purported to be from the intelligence community, and he purported to have rather a big scandal to explain to me. But of course, in my business, I receive quite a few purported scandals from purported insiders, many of which turn out to be disturbed people or misled people or fakes. So I was quite skeptical at first, but he won my confidence over time, and he tried to decide whether he should give me his confidence. He was worried about talking to someone from the mainstream media. He was afraid that I or my news organization would refuse to publish if government told us not to. And it took him quite a while to decide whether he could trust me.
Yeah. And, I mean, the book about Snowden, well, not so much about Snowden as about the release of the surveillance information and your digging and delving, is very much like a sort of detective book, as you know, rather than just like the book Snowden telling the details of his life and what he did. It very much takes you into the world of the journalist.
Well, in Dark Mirror, I wanted to sort of open the door, part the curtain on what it's like to do investigative reporting in the field of national security, because it's the kind of question I get most often when I speak to people about surveillance. Yes, but how did you meet Snowden? Exactly how did that transaction go? How did you decide you could trust him? How did you know this material was authentic? What was it like to talk to government about classified secrets? Did you ever hold information back? I reproduced these conversations verbatim throughout the book, scene by scene, in order to show how an evidence-based mainstream reporter verifies and authenticates and makes decisions on publication. And I thought that was as much a part of the story as the disclosures themselves.
Yes, I mean, it wasn't always an easy relationship that you and Snowden had. You know, I think it developed over time, but there were times when he really got irritated with you, and I think there was a bit of the vice versa as well.
It was a fraught relationship. I mean, we had different objectives, as is often the case with a reporter and a source. We just don't often examine that and display it for the public to see. But Snowden had an ideology, and he had a point of view, and I seemed to pick zealots to write about because he was, rather zealous in his own views on this, and he tried to draw very sharp boundaries about what he would and wouldn't talk about, and I wanted to talk about everything, and I pressed him. At one point, he says to me, "Are you purposely asking me questions you know I won't answer just to piss me off?" And the answer was no. I was trying to shift the boundaries a little bit, and he could be quite funny and charming, but he had no sense of humor about his cause. No.
Okay. I mean, just looking back at Angler again, it's interesting that much of the initiation of the work within the community of the NSA and the CIA, etc., that led to the surveillance that Snowden uncovered and publicized through yourselves and others, started at that time with the Cheney vice presidency.
Well, it did, motivated by 9/11 and the sense that the United States was vulnerable as it had not been in a very long time. Cheney called together, he had separate similar conversations with the head of the CIA and the head of the NSA. And he asked them, what is it that you're not doing that you could do if you were released from legal constraints? Just suppose the law wasn't there to stop you. What would you do? And that became his recipe book. And so you had a huge shift in the secret legal interpretation of law that enabled the CIA to use interrogation techniques that anyone in the world would regard as torture, and it allowed the NSA to start doing surveillance at home, which had been forbidden by law for many years.
Yes, it was quite interesting when you're talking about the torture and, of course, the Geneva Convention, that it was basically the president who could decide what was torture and what wasn't torture.
Well, it was Cheney's view that the president could do that.
Yeah,
it was Cheney's view that the president, and Cheney is building on consensus constitutional views and then taking them to extremes. It is generally understood in the United States because of a clause in the Constitution which states that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That is interpreted to mean that the president is the chief interpreter of law. You can't execute the law without interpreting it. And so it was Cheney's view that the president's interpretation of law ruled over everything, that no one could question it, that because he was the one who had to execute, no other member of the executive branch and no member of any other branch, as far as Cheney was concerned, could second guess the president on what the law said. Now, that is not a generally accepted view of rather more complicated balance of power in the United States, but it was Cheney's view. He convinced Bush of it, and that meant that If Bush said it wasn't torture, it wasn't torture.
But the nemesis came along in the end, didn't it?
Indeed, it did. I mean, Cheney overreached, and as happens to everyone sooner or later who overreaches, the system fought back. And in the second term, Bush came to understand the cost of following Cheney's sort of doctrinaire advice. And it was over surveillance. It was over the NSA warrantless activities at home, which so Cheney and his allies had interpreted as lawful, but with the Justice Department said was not lawful. Cheney almost led Bush into a political disaster because they were hours away from having a mass resignation at the Justice Department, which would have been immensely damaging to Bush in an election year. It was 2004. And he was running for his second term as president when he found out at the last minute that Cheney was provoking this mass resignation. And Cheney said, well, if they won't go along, then let them go. Bush said, that's the end of my campaign. No, thank you. And compromised. So, I mean, Cheney would have taken that fight all the way off the cliff.
Yes, because he was, as you said, very principled and never bent.
Never bent.
No. Coming back to Snowden again, obviously there was the material that was released. You were able to unpack some of that, and through your new links with the Washington Post, because you went back to the Washington Post, you got re-employed by them and brought various other people along with you as well. So they would be journalists. The relationship with Snowden, as you say, developed as you were trying to understand more and more about the different things that were in this set of materials that you were provided with. Eventually, a kind of a situation arose where, you having been persona non grata at many meetings and junkets, as you described them around the piece, where previously, or jamborees, I think was the word you used. Are you now back in favour, or if not in favour, at least able to, link up with these people again who cold-shouldered you for quite a long time?
Yes, to some extent. I had spent years covering national security issues and sometimes annoying the sort of national security establishment, sometimes getting them quite angry. But I was considered, in their view, part of the kind of legitimate foreign policy press. They saw the necessity of talking to me. I'd formed relationships and in some cases friendships over the years. And nearly all that went out the window when the Snowden story began. They felt such a sense of betrayal at the loss of these secrets that they regarded me as an accomplice,
yes,
an agent of this betrayal. And people who I'd spoken to for years wouldn't speak to me at all, or spoke only to give me a piece of their mind and then stalked off. And what's happened is that the election of Trump has changed that. As one of these high-ranking officials told me, this is a national emergency, and you and the press are part of the first responders. And we've got to talk to you because the world's got to know what's up with this guy Trump.
Okay.
And some of them have reconsidered their views on the surveillance machinery that they helped create. They've seen they've seen a little bit more justice in the point of view that Snowden had, which was that the machinery itself was such a threat if it fell into the wrong hands that it ought not to be built. And this group, the people who built and ran it for years, trusted themselves to do the right thing. And they trusted the presidents they worked for, whether Republican or Democratic. But they suddenly were presented with a president who is not constrained by law or norms or the worldview that governed U.S. foreign policy for 50 years, and they suddenly see a bit more danger in the power that's been accumulated on his behalf.
In the book, you describe a virtual meeting between Edward Snowden and Daniel Ellsberg. That must have been very interesting, as the man who linked the Pentagon Papers and the man who leaked all the NSA surveillance and other surveillance. How did they compare?
So Ellsberg was sort of the paradigm of a national security whistleblower for all those decades. He had been a true insider. He was a Harvard PhD. He was a full-on member of the national security establishment himself. He worked directly on the Pentagon Papers, which was the secret history of the Vietnam War, and which also showed that generals and presidents had been lying about the progress of the war. When he became so disillusioned by what he saw that he felt that he had to leak it first to the New York Times and then to the Washington Post. Snowden was not that kind of insider. He was a self-educated man, not a PhD. He was not an author of the documents he created. So in that way, superficially, they seem to be quite different. But they saw a kinship in one another, and they saw a common sense that if no one else was acting, they had to act. They both believed that lots of people around them saw things as they did, understood the wrongness of the public lies, understood the wrongness of the programs they were exposing, but were afraid or somehow deterred from telling the world. And they shared that quality of urgency of action and recognized each other as cousins, so to speak.
Yeah. It was a very interesting section of the book. You've since become somewhat friendly with Edward Snowden. You've met him in Russia and had his little robot around the piece talking to you?
Yes. Most of our communications over the years have been just by text on the keyboard, either live chat over anonymous channels or encrypted emails. But I have gone to see him twice in Russia, spent many, many hours in person, eating bad room service food and hiding out in an obscure hotel. And from time to time, we've done secure video links. In one case, to a, as you say, a sort of robot that can. It's sort of like a giant screen on wheels, and it can maneuver left, right, forward, back around a room, which sounds like a gimmick, but it does enable him to participate more fully in meetings. He can see and be seen. He can look over papers and documents. He can move around to talk to someone else in the room. That was rather a fun experience, interviewing him in his robot incarnation.
Yeah.
He told me if I'm ever being pursued by a mad robot, I should just walk into an elevator to cut the Wi-Fi signal.
Okay.
That's the way he thinks.
Now, again, after years, you've now you're now working at the Century Foundation. I think it will be interesting for some of the people watching this to know what the Century Foundation is, what it does, and what you do there. So
I have two jobs now. I'm a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and I am very recently joined the staff of The Atlantic, which is one of our premier magazines of journalism and ideas in the States. The Century Foundation was my home during the entirety of the writing of Dark Mirror, and I'm quite grateful to them for hosting me there. My part of the foundation was a small practice on security, surveillance, and privacy, in which we published sort of thought leaders on the subject from around the country and around the world, actually, to talk about issues in medical privacy, in face recognition, and so on. The foundation is a small, progressive think tank based in New York that focuses primarily on education, labor, and health issues, and is quite influential in the current sort of public debate on those subjects. At the Atlantic, I'm going to be working on long form, long lead time articles, and my first one, which I'm working on now, has got to do with voting in the 2020 presidential election. And where that goes, we'll have to see.
Absolutely. So are you're working at the Atlantic and doing this work at the Century Foundation. Are you writing another book at the moment?
Well, I think I'm going to have to spend a bit more time forgetting what it's like to write a book before I do another one. It's always so much harder than you imagine it will be, at least harder than I imagine. And I think I need a little more recovery time before I start the next project.
Because I would quite like to see that book that rests between Angler and Dark Mirror, how the agencies moved from given that, or should I say being asked that question by Cheney, to realizing what they'd actually been asked to imagine that Snowden then released. Okay, well, that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Bart. When we publish this conversation, we'll make reference to all of your publications. I don't think that Contending with Keegan is available in the UK, but I know that Angler and Dark Mirror are.
Yes, they've both been published by British publishers.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that you continue to remain healthy out of the city, and that by the time you have to go back again, the elevators and the subways are clean.
I wish you health and safety yourself, and thank you for a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you, Bart. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Take care.